Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the Independent Outlook. We offer you an independent take on the events of the day, and hopefully from principled and sometimes even a philosophical perspective. I'm Graham Walker from the Independent Institute, coming to you from Oakland, California, just across the bay from San Francisco, and I am joined for the conversation today by my two colleagues, David Theroux and Williamson Evers. David Theroux is the founder and president of the Independent Institute. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And I'm delighted to also have Williamson Evers, who goes by Bill among friends, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Thank you, Bill, for joining us for this conversation today.
Thank you for having me.
It's a lot of fun to talk to one another. Also, it's fun because we have a lot of friends around the country and maybe even overseas who are joining us for some of these conversations. We are being hosted on ThinkSpot, and we are grateful to our friends and partners at ThinkSpot for making that possible. It's also going out to people through a number of other venues, including Facebook. And so thank you, everybody, for joining us for this conversation. So we have a lot to talk about. Good grief. It's a week out to the election, just under. And we'll hardly run out of things to say, I think, friends, today. Let's start with thinking about the big news, that we just came through with the new Justice Amy Coney Barrett joining the U.S. Supreme Court as an Associate Justice. Well, I noticed that in the Rose Garden ceremony where she was given the oath of office by Justice Thomas, that unlike previous time, everybody in the crowd seemed to be wearing face masks. That was an interesting difference. But more interesting and more important was probably what she said. Do you remember her speech, either of you, and anything stick in your mind about it?
Well, she gave a pretty good summary of textualism and the role of judges as opposed to other participants in government. And, some people don't like that. I mean, I was just reading a regular newspaper description of textualism and originalism, and they quoted various people saying, oh, it has a conservative tendency. And the alternative, really, to textualism is living constitution. So the idea of that is you, the judge, somehow capture what Hegel called the spirit of the age, and you infuse the law with this spirit. And this is a view that, say, Woodrow Wilson held. And I think it's, first of all, I give no special brief, no special warrant to some intellectual or jurist's idea of the spirit of the age. And, so the idea of textualism is you treat it as if it's a contract or something like some other legal document that you were interpreting. And so you bear in mind what the parties understood and what in terms of the language of the time, what was the meaning of the time? What's the dictionary meaning of the time when this was passed? And that's how you interpret it, as you would if you were doing a contract.
I read some comments about how originalism ties us to the anti-women and and pro-slavery attitudes of the 18th century.
Well, the problem with that is that the Constitution was conceived in ways that it could be amended to change its reach and the definition of terms and what have you, to clarify things and address current concerns. And indeed, it did do that. And what Bill is saying is that you could sort of take it to an extreme, is that if you take the living Constitution view literally, there's no purpose in having a written document at all.
At all, yeah, right.
There's no purpose to the words. Just sort of infuse what your current views might be, however that might be conceived.
Right.
And then you don't have a rule of law at all. One thing I would add to what Bill was saying about Amy Coney Barrett's presentation at the Rose Garden ceremony is that her talk, in many respects, was an outline of a class on constitutional law and a constitutional republic as it was conceived by America's founders. And I think she did a really superb and careful, measured presentation of those ideas, and it's a consistent application of those ideas. So I think that looking through that lens, we can see how she's going to approach many issues.
Yeah.
I suspect there'll be some surprises for people,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that the purpose of a judge is to be a referee, to call balls and strikes, so to speak, um, and not someone who changes the rules of the game. The third page coach and um, the third page empire and so forth in a baseball game doesn't change the rules of the game.
Right. So the Democrats, some of them, are calling for court packing.
Yeah.
And this is something that Franklin Roosevelt tried back in 1937, began even a little earlier than that. But his idea was, as some of these judges were older, he was going to add judges up to 6 to counter the older judges. But he discovered that even in his own party, his own vice president, John Nance Gardner, opposed it. Many liberal intellectuals like Dorothy Thompson, the newspaper columnist, the Harvard professor, Erwin Griswold, lots of people opposed it, and they weren't able to do this court packing. And so it's since 1869, it stayed at 9 justices.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself, a couple of years ago, she gave some kind of an interview where she herself said that she didn't think that adding numbers to the court would be a good idea because it would just be so blatantly political. Well, I agree with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, maybe once.
Well, also the Biden group and progressives more generally are now claiming that the Republicans have been packing the court with Kavanaugh and so forth, and most recently with Barrett, and so essentially, it's a good example of the living Constitution. They changed the term court packing to be basically going through the Constitutional procedure to add people to the court whose approach or methodology they may not like. So that's an attempt to try and give themselves cover for an attempt to actually politicize the court and make it into
packing means expansion.
Right.
With
and so
intent.
the idea essentially, of course, is to reduce the impact of the conservative justices, the originalists that are on the court or approaching originalism in some way, and to not just politicize the court, but make it essentially to eliminate the third branch of government. It's not independent. It's subject to the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Yeah, what a mistake, huh? I mean, one thing I found very striking, both in her hearings and in recent previous ones, going back a number of times actually, is that Republicans in the Senate have been very reluctant to say in those hearings or otherwise that they have an anti-abortion or pro-life litmus test that they are applying. But the converse doesn't seem to be true, that Democratic members of the Senate and pro-choice senators seem to have not the slightest reluctance to say that they are determined that we need judges on the court who will defend a woman's right to choose an abortion. I wonder why the one side is reluctant to make it a litmus test and the other side is not reluctant to make it a litmus test at all. I haven't figured that one out.
I think that progressives believe that they are, again, the elite. Their views are objectively true, and they have an intellectual class and a political class that stands behind them. And if you differ, then you're suspect and are fringe. And it's this arrogance, sort of a conceit that is behind a lot of what we see on campuses and politics and elsewhere. And that's why the attempt to disparage her, and of course with Kavanaugh before, and there's been a history now of this with Thomas and so on, is viewed as legitimate because they believe that what they're proposing is the only truth, even if that truth changes over time.
Yeah, it really does go back, maybe even to answer my own question, it goes back to a very different understandings of what the law and constitutional law is. As you said earlier, David, for it to be constitutional, that is to say, a super law which constrains and limits power, its meaning can't vary over time depending upon changing opinions. It has to be fixed unless it's formally amended. And so maybe their view is that it doesn't matter. They want to project their values onto the text, and conservatives, well, at least constitutional conservatives, actually, on principle, oppose projecting even their own values onto the words of the text. Maybe it's pretty a fundamental difference.
And that's why sometimes Amy Coney Barrett or Brett Kavanaugh or Neil Gorsuch or some of these people are going to disappoint Republican legislators because they have a careful construction of the law and not necessarily blowing with the political winds. So I think it's so we're also facing some litigation connected with the November election right now. We've just had some decisions on this having to do with what things are counted. Graham, you've been watching this?
Yeah, some of it I have been watching. Last Wednesday there was a decision by the U.S. Supreme Court overruling a federal district court in Alabama. The Secretary of State of Alabama had ruled out of order the use of curbside voting in Alabama. And then there had been some litigation, and then actually the Federal Circuit Court overruled the Alabama Secretary of State and said, no, you needed curbside voting because it's a necessary accommodation to the circumstances of voters and limitations and so forth. And the U.S. Supreme Court, 5-3, it was still 8 at that point, overruled the Circuit Court and let Alabama Secretary of State make the decision that he was authorized to make by virtue of his office. So the coverage of this suggested that, the Supreme Court didn't care about people with limits who needed to do curbside voting. And as for myself, I think curbside voting sounds great. But the principle that the court was acting on was the officer of the state of Alabama appropriately authorized to make the determination that he made? Not is curbside voting healthy, nice, desirable or not. It wasn't a matter of policy preferences that the court was making. It was determining basically a jurisdictional decision, who had the jurisdiction. And so they said, there was no reason to overturn the jurisdiction of this officer of the state of Alabama. So no curbside voting in Alabama. But again, it's not because those justices on the court who upheld that view don't like curbside voting. It's because they couldn't see any basis in the law for overturning the decisions of that officer of the state of Alabama. It's that rule of law mindset which characterizes.
I think we're going to see this. There's going to be all kinds of problems about ballots coming in late in the mail or times being extended in various places but not in various other places, and all signature matching policies being different within the same state. There's all sorts of things that are going to come up. And I think that these justices are going to decide based on the statute and not whether it advantages Republicans or Democrats.
Exactly.
So sometimes the Republicans are going to be disappointed. And, that's just the way it goes. If they don't like it, they should have changed the law or tried to get the law changed before the election.
Well, for example, in the cases that just came out earlier this week and the end of last week regarding Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had ruled that it wasn't necessary to disqualify ballots if there were mismatched signatures, and that it was okay for ballots to be received 3 days after the election, mail-in ballots. And the U.S. Supreme Court has not overruled that, and I doubt that they will. But on the other hand, then there was the case in Wisconsin where the state had decided that the ballots had to be received by November 3rd, Election Day, and the U.S. Supreme Court didn't overturn that either. Some people might say, well, which is it? Do they like to give leeway or they don't like to give leeway? Well, the principle is not that. The principle is who had the duly constituted authority to make the determinations. You don't change the laws right before the election.
So I think unless they see something that's like horribly racial discrimination
Yeah,
that's
right.
on
It
an
has to be
overt
something.
basis or something like that, they're going to let the states determine, as the Constitution divided up authority, the states determine the rules pertaining to voting.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's true in many cases, but I do think that there are going to be instances, perhaps the one in Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that signatures did not have to match what's on.
That is kind of odd, isn't it?
Right, especially since the election law in Pennsylvania says it does.
Yeah, that's the
So
weird
I
thing
think
about
in those
that
cases,
case.
I think the court may well overrule a state Supreme Court's decision because clearly it's not a textual decision.
Especially because the U.S. Constitution says that it guarantees to all the states a Republican form of government,
Right.
which involves the holding to the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which had previously authorized these decisions to be made in certain ways, and then the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturns that. Is that a violation of the rule of law for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court? And I think that's your point, right, David?
Yes, and clearly the federal government has an interest in the election. It's the federal election.
Right.
So if there are non-textual decisions, don't be surprised if they overrule it. But Bill's right. The 10th Amendment is an important issue here.
It is, yeah.
And so, we'll see.
In the Pennsylvania case, it may come down to, on the one hand, the U.S. Supreme Court's sense of deference to its sister court, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, versus its recognition and deference to the legislature of Pennsylvania, which had established the rules. In the Wisconsin case, Neil Gorsuch wrote this. This was the one that actually, said they had to be received by November 3rd, and the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, allowed that to stand. Gorsuch wrote, "No one doubts that conducting a national election amid a pandemic poses serious challenges, but none of that means individual judges may improvise with their own election rules in place of those the people's representatives have adopted." And if that's the principle, David may be right, that Pennsylvania decision by the Pennsylvania court may be subject to contest later.
I mean, you can take reductio absurdum. What if the Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled that no ballots would be accepted? I mean, clearly that goes against the election law of Pennsylvania, and clearly the federal government has an interest in the election. They wouldn't put up with that. It's the same issue about discriminating, as Bill was saying, based on racial grounds or gender grounds.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but I do think Bill's right. I think, and it's not just this issue of the elections. I think it's going to be other areas too, not the least of which is the Affordable Care Act. But there, it's going to be interesting. But I do think that the outcome of this is going to strengthen the hand of the originalists, because people are going to see that they're not compromising. I
think, for example, many people think, Amy Coney Barrett's just going to throw out the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. Maybe not, because the way the subrability aspects of it are, it may save it in various ways. Same with abortion. It may be that abortion has been precedent for so long, she will look at it and say, regulations of abortion, constraining time, place, and manner, things like this, but not really overturning Roe v. Wade. So there may be, I'm not knowing, I'm just saying these things may happen.
They may. In the case of the ACA, the Texas court that ruled Obamacare unconstitutional also throws a dimension into it as far as the 10th Amendment is concerned. So, it's going to be very interesting.
One of our participants has just thrown me a question here in our question box, which everybody's free to use, by the way. You can send a question. Do you think that the conservative judges have too much respect for precedent? Well, we've been addressing that obliquely, and I think we don't yet know. But too much respect for precedent could only have one real meaning, would be to respect precedent over against a clear stated proposition in the text of the U.S. Constitution. That would be the only thing that would be too much respect for precedent, in my view.
Yeah, but also I think there is this natural law basis
Yeah.
that will also factor in.
So you can see that in what Justice Thomas has written,
Right.
and Amy Coney Barrett also. So if they don't view it as a super precedent of some sort, and what that means is a kind of term of art in law, and they don't see it directly contravening a provision of the Constitution. But I think we could go on to the presidential debates. We kind
Yeah,
of
let's go.
covered
That's where I
this.
was going to go next. So who won and who lost, Bill Evers? What do you think?
Well, I think they both did pretty well. I think, President Trump certainly was easier to understand in this debate than he was in the first one. And although Biden kind of kicked off the interrupting in the first debate, President Trump certainly went overboard in interrupting. And in this debate, the moderator did a little bit of interrupting of him, but I think the president is right that she did a pretty fair job. She even, as compared to Chris Wallace, and certainly as compared to the vice presidential debate moderator, she tried to put in a few questions that had a kind of conservative or libertarian tinge to them. And that was kind of a fascinating change of pace. I think, Biden repeated the lie of the year from back in the Obama campaign, when Obama said, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. And so Biden said that under Obamacare, if you liked your health care exact plan, you could keep it, and the same would happen under his program. And so that was kind of a big error on his part, even a factual error. And then his reveal on fracking and eventually going away from all fossil fuels was probably too candid for his election strategy, and may hurt him in Pennsylvania, which is vital for Trump, and Oklahoma and Texas, which are probably still going to be Trump, but the Democrats are trying to penetrate states like that. So Ohio is another state that Trump has to be contesting and is putting a lot of money and effort into right now, and has oil. So I think that, Biden was being honest, but possibly not Machiavellian enough for his own handlers.
David, was he just giving a nod to his left wing?
Yeah, I mean, he's trying to keep everybody happy. It's interesting, I think, that in the debate, he lied very specifically numerous times. The first lie was a denial of there being any factual evidence for the Hunter Biden laptop, computer, the emails, and so on.
Calling
He's
it
just
Russian
denying.
disinformation. That was.
So he's claiming it's a Russian disinformation attack. His second lie was saying he never used the super predator quote about blacks. The third lie was his claiming that he did not oppose the travel ban that Trump did as far as people coming from China or Europe. The fourth lie was about the border cages that the Obama-Biden administration created. The fifth lie was, of course, this issue of fracking. And to Trump's credit, he says he has it on videotape, and he produced it. And so it's Biden is in the presidential primary debates came out strongly against fracking. And of course, his running mate, Kamala Harris, has been the most vocal in the Senate supporting the Green New Deal, as he has. So he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. One thing I might also mention to follow up on Bill's point about the moderator, I agree. I think that she was, Kristen Welker was the best of the moderators by far.
Clearly, yes. Mm-hmm.
Especially compared to Savonal Guthrie, who
Right.
did the town hall. She was the worst. And I think Chris Wallace was a close second. And to Welker's credit, she did ask, Trump originally, but she followed up and asking about the Hunter Biden issue. And then Biden, maybe through his headphone handlers, tried to deny it. And again, his discussion, the Green New Deal was totally sloppy. It was contradictory. I think that overall, the expectation of Biden in the first debate had a very low bar. And since he didn't, his cognitive abilities seemed to be fine.
Yeah, he didn't have any meltdown or freezing times.
Right. So I think he came out of that better than Trump, not including the whole food fight problem of interruptions. But in the final debate, so-called third debate, was that Trump won because, for no other reason, that there was a low bar for him, and so he surpassed that significantly.
He didn't sound like a tantrum toddler. He sounded like a normal adult.
He kept his cool. He was deferential to Welker. He was tough, but he wasn't abusive really to Biden. He was, clear, trying to call him on his claims. And so I think that overall, Trump clearly won the final debate. And I think that overall, the approach that Trump used, which is similar to his rallies and his overall message, is that he is for can-do Americanism. There's a bright future. We have something to look forward to. And Biden's entire pitch was that we're going to enter a dark world.
He's just said that recently.
I'm going to control your lies, essentially. Hand us power. The future is doom and gloom. And I think that that kind of sort of worrisome approach, in some respects, reflects his hibernating in his basement. He's hiding out. So people need to sort of hide out because the future is dim. So I think that was a very important part of the difference of the tone of both of them.
But I don't know if the public's going to pick this up because the ads for Biden are kind of breezily optimistic, and the way they're pushing him.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, if this
is it believable?
dark winter stuff had happened earlier on in the campaign, it might have defined him in a different way. But I think so. As we look at the different states, you can see that President Trump feels he has Florida in the bag because he's cut back on advertising there. And he's pushing advertising in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so from his standpoint, I'm not saying they're not going to Arizona. Obviously, he went to Arizona today. He cares about Nevada, all these sorts of things. But he needs several of these states that I just named, and these Great Lakes states, and particularly Pennsylvania. I think in Pennsylvania, the combination of the Philadelphia riots that are, I guess, still going on, and the fracking fossil fuels problem may be very helpful. One problem we all have is that so many people have voted early, and there are only 7 states that allow you to somehow, it must be very complicated to do, but 7 states allow you to change your vote.
I missed that one, Bill. Wow.
Oh, no, yeah, I have the list of them right here.
Well, some of the states are pretty good sized states, though.
Well, the Connecticut, Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, New York, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin.
Right.
Good
so
grief.
Some of those are battleground
pretty
states.
Important states. Allow it. So, but California is not one of them. Anyway,
but California is not a battleground state.
Yeah, we're not worried about California, you might say.
No, I don't think so. But actually, we have a few congressional races in California. The Democrats swept the Orange County delegation in Southern California, which is where I often live. And so two of them might be taken back by Republicans.
Mhm.
One is Harley Ruda. He's the Democratic incumbent, and he's in a contest with Michelle Steele, who's a county supervisor. They are neck and neck in the polling. They are neck and neck in fundraising. They are both running extremely, they and partisans for them are running extremely harsh ads. I mean, I have really rarely seen such tough advertising. We have another case where Cisneros, who's a man who won the lottery, so he has a lot of money, and he narrowly defeated young Kim, and he is running for re-election. So that's a contested one too.
I'd like to point out that this morning in the New York Times, an article was published that I found extremely surprising and relevant to this whole question of who's got the edge in these various states. The article says, the writer says that the single most surprising demographic trend of this cycle is President Trump's gains among non-white voters.
Yes.
Particularly young black men.
Particularly young black men. It's just fascinating.
But also Hispanics.
Yeah. And apparently, you know, that typically, obviously, and still the Democratic Party has a higher percentage of support among non-whites and versus whites and so forth. But the difference, the gap has changed by 16%. And he says here that Mr. Biden has lost almost exactly as much ground among non-white voters as he has gained among white voters. So the Biden has picked up white voters and Trump has picked up non-white voters.
Mm-hmm.
So this is interesting because it's potentially consistent with some of this working class orientation that Trump is bringing in. So that in these states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, the Republicans have done a huge effort at trying to register voters, particularly non-college educated white males. And they've apparently done a pretty good job at it. But these other young males are also attracted. And I think in Pennsylvania, one of the articles said that they are a potentially deciding factor, the young blacks in Pennsylvania. So we'll see, black men. So we'll see whether that turns out to be true.
Here's how the New York Times very tentatively and reluctantly puts it here. It says, in Time Siena polling so far this fall, black and Hispanic voters appear somewhat receptive to the kinds of conservative messages usually derided as racist dog whistles. In polling in September, for example, non-white voters split roughly evenly on whether law and order or the coronavirus was more important to their presidential vote. This is the New York Times telling us that non-white voters are really concerned about law and order, and they should be. I'm with them.
Right.
Well, I think that's true, but I also think that the economic recovery from the Obama-Biden period through deregulation and tax cuts and the opportunity zones has been measurable for many black men in particular. And then on top of it, you've got Kanye West, and you've got a whole range of rappers, black rappers and so forth, who've come out in favor of Trump. And that their attitude is, I don't care what you white liberals think. It's clearly happening. And even Van Jones was saying that.
And the criminal justice reform, which
yes,
Trump and his family put a huge amount of effort and political
right.
capital into,
yeah,
is not nothing in the black community.
It's not, and especially with Biden having been one of the major
and the
sponsors of the earlier
right.
measure, which incarcerated more black men.
Well, any mention of Joe Biden's family, of course, brings us back to, at least briefly, to the question of what Hunter Biden did or did not do and what meetings Joe Biden did or did not take with Hunter Biden's business partners. Of course, he denied it in the debate, David, as you noted already, but the evidence keeps coming out. The New York Post published the emails and so forth, and then there was a interview last night on Tucker Carlson's show with this Tony Bobulinski, who had been a business partner. I would like you to comment on this initially, David, but first, just from my sort of sideline perspective here, and I don't understand all the details, but I'm trying to get this right in my mind that it seems that Joe Biden has boasted publicly that he threatened to withhold U.S. aid to Ukraine in order to induce the Ukraine government to pull back the prosecutor who was looking into Burisma, the company that he had a financial stake in himself, or else his son did, or maybe both.
And his son was on the board.
Yeah, but Joe has boasted about how he leaned on them by threatening to withhold U.S. aid. But then, when I roll back the script in my mind, the videotape in my mind, President Trump was impeached for having tried to, but not threatened to withhold, not withhold aid, but he talked about withholding aid to the Ukrainians if they asking them to look into this apparent violation of U.S. law, that is to say, the self-interest and conflict of interest. How come the one was impeachable, but the other seems to be just ignored?
Well, the same reason of why this issue is not being investigated. The Tony Bobulinski interview that Tucker Carlson did is incredibly powerful. Bobulinski is given over thousands and thousands of emails and many other documents. No one is denying the veracity of any of this. He has corroboration with other sources, and it's simply not politically expedient for the Biden group. And I suspect that if Biden wins, the whole thing will be swept under the rug.
Well, now, candidate Biden's campaign did issue a statement after the New York Post article saying that a review of his calendars did not show any such meeting.
Yeah, but what does that mean? Nothing.
They didn't say the meeting didn't occur. They just said that the calendar didn't show the meeting.
Because they didn't put it on the calendar. I mean, there are witnesses that Bobulinski met with Biden twice, and what Bobulinski was there's a lot to go through, but just a couple of tiny things.
Tell us a couple of details.
One is that Bobulinski was hired to be the CEO of this company to Sinahawk Holdings, and without getting into the detail, he points out that what he discovered was the Biden group, Jim Biden, Hunter Biden, and others, were involved not just in China and the Ukraine and Russia, but also in France, in Kyrgyzstan, in Romania, in Oman. This was a huge operation.
Luxembourg.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
Luxembourg, exactly. And that this system was a shakedown operation. And the emails show how Biden's name was essentially kept under wraps through accounts, through all sorts of things. So, it's basically handing over to the FBI the trail to follow, and the information, and the view that Biden said it in the debate was this is a Russian disinformation campaign. Well, I mean, the laptop has nothing to do with Russia. It was owned by Hunter Biden. No one's denying that.
Right.
And so on and so forth. So I think that what we have is the swamp being peeled back a little bit for people to see what actually is the kind of thing that goes on through the State Department and through regulatory agencies and so forth, and that this kind of mercantilism and extortion and shakedown is real. And so how much more is it? I think many of us would suspect it's not unusual.
Well, Bobulinski himself indicated, we were just mentioning some of these other countries, but he said what he had intimate knowledge of was maybe 10% of what their overall activity was.
He only knew 10%. So he was a minor. He viewed himself as actually, he did it because he was upset at Schiff, Congressman Schiff, accusing him of being treasonous. And he was an officer in the Navy. His grandfather was an officer, and he viewed it as a sort of a patriotic duty. Plus, he wanted to protect his family name, and that at one point he mentioned that he'll his role in this will be that he leaves stage left because there's so much there that can be uncovered. What he's turning over is trivial in the scheme of things. So you'd think that a reporter wants to get the Pulitzer Prize would say, "Wow,
Yeah.
there's an opportunity here."
Yeah, big opportunity. Well, I'm not a Trump fan, but I'm really troubled by this. I mean, it just seems to me that the level of concern about this is so low when the magnitude of it is so high, whereas the level of concern about some of Trump's crazy doings has been so high when the magnitude of it has been relatively low compared to this kind of thing, which is, really trading on the leverage and power and prestige of the office as the Vice President of the United States to press other countries and foreign companies into the financial benefit of the Biden family. This just seems kind of stunning to me. But no one's talking about it, except on the alternative media, on the sites, New York Post. Thanks goodness to the New York Post.
Right. Yeah.
And the same thing seems true on how the story then played out after the New York Post reviewed it. Facebook suppressed it in the results. Twitter wouldn't allow the New York Post to, what do you call it? What's the word I'm looking for, Bill? You forward it to repost it. They wouldn't allow people to repost it.
Well, the Post is not allowed to post anything.
Yeah, it's on its own Twitter account.
And what Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, has said is that, well, we realized this was a mistake, and the New York Post should delete their account and then go back and create a new account, and then they can post it again, which means they have to agree to the new terms that Twitter has when you create an account.
That's right. That's what that means.
So that's really what's going on. And to Senator Cruz's credit, when he asked Dorsey today about that, he drilled into it and made that a clear point that that's what they're doing here. They're trying to circumvent the situation. It won't take responsibility for what they're doing, and they didn't apply it to the felony-based release of Trump's tax returns. That was fine. So clearly, and my view is that as a publisher, they should be free to do this. Like a publisher of any sort of publication. But if they're a platform and they're claiming that everybody has equal access, there's a breach of contract, and they shouldn't be able to.
Ted Cruz said earlier today that Twitter was behaving like a Democratic super PAC in the way it handled the information.
Right.
Which was kind of interesting. I mean, I would say Twitter's a private company. If they want to behave like a Democratic advocacy group, let them do so at their own expense, right?
They have property rights. They should be able to use the property in peaceful ways as they so choose, but they want to have their cake and eat it too here, and they know it.
Apparently, Mark Zuckerberg said in the same hearing that he was not aware that Facebook's own election integrity official, Anna Makanju, had been a policy advisor to Joe Biden. And he wasn't aware of that, and it didn't really, therefore, realize that it gave the appearance that the whole high-tech world was totally in the pocket of the progressive left. Imagine such an appearance being noticed by anybody. Well, apparently he was not aware of it and didn't ask until he was put on the spot today. But what do you think about all this, Bill?
Well, I think, these companies are making serious mistakes as companies in terms of their goodwill that they have with a large part of the population, and they're shooting themselves in the foot. But I think if you do away with Section 230, you're going to see these large platforms deny conservatives a place. It will just be a shredding of all controversial ideological things. And these platforms do not have the capacity to individually curate, edit, whatever you want to call it, millions of things being posted. And therefore, they're just going to have broad things that keep conservatives out, or the federal government will step in and have a federal commission on balanced internet and or the FCC is going to take it over, and I don't know who's going to win the election here, but let's say Biden were to win the election.
Mm-hmm.
I don't myself look forward to a Biden appointed FCC adjudicating the internet, or a Biden administration created and staffed and both the permanent staff and the political appointees in a Biden administration having a commission on truth on the internet or something like that. Most of these laws that we've seen on hate speech on the internet, or internet balance, or internet special rights in various countries around the world, are just exemplars of political abuse in the way they've been used.
It's just an example.
I think, people are worried about some kind of abuse by these companies. A lot of this is in the detail. It could be, I haven't seen it, it could be that there's some thing with only innocuous consequences that would better the situation. I haven't seen the wording of any such thing. To me, the big danger is that Big Brother runs the internet.
Why not just have a situation in which they're cut loose and Google either becomes a liberal or left liberal entity, and others compete for being neutral, and others are conservative? Why protect
That's fine with me.
These so-called walled gardens? Let them compete and not be protected.
That's fine with me. But I don't think, let's say you're the New York Times, and somebody posts something that in the comment section on the internet on your platform that somehow causes litigation of some sort against you. I think you should be able to turn to the Section 230 and say, hey,
it's not
the
our
commentator
content.
wrote this, not me. I mean, Rich Laurie used to be the National Review's online editor, and they didn't even, in the early days, because of their fear of all this potential for litigation, they didn't allow comments at all, because they did not want to be held responsible for some crazy commentator posting something that got them in trouble. And I'm sympathetic to that. I also think if they do allow comments, or they do allow posting, if they don't want to have somebody on it, let's say they don't like Bill Evers, they don't like the cut of my jib, they can say no. Or they can edit something that I did, they don't like it, take it off somehow. I do agree with David that we should look forward to competition, but I also don't think that antitrust laws, cases brought by the Justice Department and antitrust against these companies, they're throwing out the consumer welfare standard and antitrust. The Trump administration, I think we should hold them carefully to standards of good behavior, but using the Federal Trade Commission against these platform companies for the content. They're trying to use the Federal Trade Commission not for commercial practices, but for the content that these people are having on their. This is not good. This is
and I would add
abuse.
to that and virtually nobody in public policy is talking about this.
No, the Trump administration is doing it.
No, I know. What I'm going to say, they're not talking about what I'm going to say, is that Google and a lot of these companies are mandated because of the Patriot Act in the USA, whatever the other, I forget the name of the other act, Patriot Act 1 and Patriot Act 2, and there's another one. They're mandated to turn over all the information, all the metadata to the NSA and other organizations, and they have these big contracts to pay for it. And there are firms that have been created to surveil people under federal contract. And my view is those contracts should be eliminated or at least put in a market-based process. And George Gilder has a book called Life After Google, in which he talks about these walled gardens like Google and so forth, Facebook, in which they are protected. And he believes that the business model of these companies would not be sustainable if they were not protected. And that's my view.
So your story about surveillance of what goes on the internet reminds me of something that I just learned about. So I served on the Trump transition back in 2016.
Right.
And so we had to sign, I don't know, 15 different non-disclosure agreements. But also when we got on board, we were asked to use a specific computer system run by the General Services Administration. And this was highly protected, and so they didn't want a hacker from another campaign or a foreign country breaking in. And they told us that don't worry, at the end, you guys walk off with all this stuff. We don't keep it, we don't retain it, because of course, China is famous for having hacked into the personnel records of the federal government and walked off with millions of records. So anyway, so it turns out they didn't live up to their own contractual agreement. Mm-hmm. They retained all this. They wouldn't allow the Trump transition to get to its own records, and they turned all the transition records over to the FBI. Very weird world we live in.
It is a weird world for sure, and it may get weirder. We're heading into the home stretch on this campaign season. I saw something today which really worried me, that apparently there's a group called Shutdown DC, which is credibly threatening to cause disruption, serious disruption, as they say, if Trump wins, or if he claims to win, either way. And they've already had a number of disruptive events. It seems pretty worrisome to me that we could indeed have some serious disruption going in the public square because of groups like Shutdown DC and others. And of course, we've already got riots going in Philadelphia on another basis. We need the temperature to drop a little bit, I think, don't we?
The first thing I'd mention about this Shutdown DC group is, to them, if Trump wins, he's by definition stolen the election, and it's a coup d'etat. Well, what if Biden wins? Why isn't that stealing the election and a coup d'etat? Now, what's the criteria they're using? There is no criteria, just because their guy didn't win.
Yeah, it's a purely ideological maneuver.
Right, but it's worse than that, because they're saying that if you don't agree with us, we're going to burn you down. So there is no legitimate opposition to their view. So the article in the Christian Headlines that documented this most recently, there've been a number of articles, is basically pointing out that the group is, publicly allied with Antifa and Black Lives Matter and whatever, and they're training people to be disruptive and violent. And yet there's no standard that you can actually use to discern why they're doing it. In other words, if Trump does no illegal activity, by definition, he's a criminal, because he differs ideologically with them.
Yeah, and it's hard not to see in how, in a case like this, and in so many others with respect to critical race theory and so forth, that the ill fruit is being born that was planted over the past 30 or 40 years, basically in classrooms and faculty lounges, where several generations of American, intellectuals, or at least pseudo-intellectuals, were trained in these ideas of what I call postmodernism, namely the idea that there's no foundational, timeless moral truths. Ultimately, everything is a matter of self-assertion. That's the doctrine. But what's interesting about that doctrine, it's a doctrine of meaninglessness, except that it justifies any kind of forceful action on behalf of your own viscerally preferred outcomes.
But the irony is that they're claiming there's no truth, not just moral truth, there's no truth. But by doing that, they're claiming that's a truth.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly, exactly.
And they're proud of the fact that they were protesting outside Senator Lindsey Graham's home in Washington.
That was malicious.
And they said they were doing that because he, quote, he's undermining democracy by jamming through another right-wing Supreme Court justice. And what Graham did was simply follow the constitutional procedures.
That's right, he just did.
So
right?
following constitutional procedures is jamming through an illegitimate justice, and is, I suppose, another coup d'etat in their minds.
Right.
Well, I think this all does lead us, as Graham suggested, to reflect on several things. One is, he said postmodernism. You could also look at Nietzsche. Nietzsche, perspectivism. Multiple perspectives. Not really sure of foundations of truth. Power being the most important thing for him. I'm caricaturing Nietzsche in saying this, but they're adopting a kind of vulgar Nietzscheanism as a background for them. Now, when we look at the Democratic and Republican, or Biden and Trump, attitudes toward police, we see the president calling for order, calling for using the National Guard, condemning very clearly looting and vandalism. Biden mostly stressing pouring more money into cities and into the police forces, but generally many in his party saying, let's take the money and put it into social work as opposed to law enforcement. I'm not saying social work never helps, but if you don't have orderly streets, the social workers are not going to be safe either. And they're not, neither of them are really addressing qualified immunity. It has bipartisan support, but
it does.
But it also, the major leaders of both parties and the candidates are not really willing to put a heavy emphasis on it. It would be helpful. So I think there's that problem. And again, as Graham was saying, and David also, this critical race theory, where you assume that all acts of constitutionalism, all rhetoric of the American political culture is just a guise, it's just a smokescreen for racial domination of whites over blacks, and that this is inescapable, is a counsel of despair, as well as a instigation to violence and destruction. So it's not a pretty picture. I hope we can get out of this. We've had other times of crisis in America where bad ideologies, where evil ideologies were present, and we have overcome them. So it's possible.
I think it can be overcome with both good principles and good facts. And I think that's one of the reasons why we do what we do here at the Independent Institute, because, underlying all this, we do have a confidence that getting people in contact with evidence and careful thought will produce good results ultimately in the discussion over the future of the country and the policies we should undertake together. More information, more facts, always better than less information and fewer facts. And so we invite everybody who needs resources on many of the public issues that we face as a country. We invite you to come to our website, independent.org, where we have a plethora of resources on a variety of topics.
And don't we have a program just coming up?
We do. In fact, tomorrow we're going to be doing another live stream, somewhat similar to today's, which will be featuring John Goodman of the Goodman Institute and a senior fellow here at the Independent Institute, who is the author of our upcoming book, soon to be published, New Way to Care, Social Protections That Put Families First. He's going to be discussing with Christopher Briggs, one of our other senior people here at the Independent Institute, an article which Mr. Briggs just had published in the New York Post on Monday about his daughter's struggle to get care and coverage under Obamacare. The piece in the New York Post on Monday was titled, "My Kid Has Cancer and Obamacare is Making Everything Worse." So tomorrow we're going to have that conversation with the father of a child who's lost her coverage due to Obamacare, and with an expert in healthcare who can actually paint out some principles that show the way forward, which will be highly relevant to whichever president we have come January 20th. So that's 3 p.m. Pacific time tomorrow. Invite everyone to come to our website and take advantage of that. It'll be through our Facebook page as well as through, I think, our Twitter feed and also ThinkSpot, if I'm not mistaken. So I think here we are at the end. I'm tempted to ask you, Bill and David, okay, who's going to win by how many points next Tuesday? But it's probably pointless even to ask you that.
Yeah.
I don't suppose you want to take a bet on that.
Not I.
I don't blame you.
I have voted, however.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, if
And
you change your vote,
I voted in time to be counted.
good for you. I hope everybody does that.
Yeah.
Thank you, David Theroux.
Thank you.
And thank you, Bill Evers.
Thank you.
Grateful to have you. Thanks to our friends on ThinkSpot and everywhere who joined us today for this episode of The Independent Outlook. Please join us next time. Bye-bye.